Part 2 ended with this introduction to divergence. Divergence is the widening discrepancy between a humanly constructed norm and the naturally emergent norm it is based upon. Initially, both are centered around the same mean of possibilities. However, because of cultural dynamics, these sometimes begin to drift apart. When a culture accepts this shift as the new normal for all to follow, it becomes settled into conventionality. Conventionality, as the term is used here, refers to those cultural norms that are rigorously enforced. Enforcement may be official, as threat of jail or a fine, or it may be unofficial, as a threat of being shunned. Either is enough to compel a majority to respect its boundaries and join each other in spurning those who violate such boundaries. Not everyone is able to fit neatly within the center of such divergent conventionality. Those intimately drawn to what is naturally possible are apt to test the rigid boundaries of such conventionality, exploring untapped potential and deviating outside the boundaries of such sacrosanct conventionality. Deviance in this sense is the departure from a conventionality that is diverged from its natural core. It is a kind of counter-divergence, a correction to those stifling norms that inhibit one's emerging growth potential. Rarely is such deviance a conscious act. The compulsion comes from a persistent pull from nature. Understandably, it is possible to overcorrect. Unnormativity can result in a portion of this deviance. Damage can occur, and people sometimes do get hurt in the rush to break free from these confining HCNs. Unfortunately, such harm is highly visible, overshadowing the noble purpose of finding liberty. Seeing only the hurt, defenders of the norms tend to overgeneralize the risk of further damage. They may see this damage as the only possible outcome for anyone deviating from their trusted conventionalities. Pseudo-opposition refers to this tendency to believe falsehoods about opponents. It tends to be an exaggeration of a trait often spotted in one's foes. It is present in such widely held beliefs that all evangelical Christians are homophobic, or all Muslims are anti-Semitic, or all Democrats want to increase the size of government, or all Republicans want to give tax cuts only to the wealthy. It is a kind of stereotype that paints all those who deviate from a valued norm as inherently untrustworthy. Consider how norms for sexuality have shifted in Western culture in the last 2 millennia. Because of mounting pressure from early Catholic authorities to crack down on Greco-Roman expressions of erotica, among other factors, the norms for sexuality were not only constricted but also tended to shift away from any end for expressing mutual intimacy. Sex was officially viewed chiefly as a reproductive function to serve the property-owning man. The wife was expected to remain a passive participant in the sex act, since she was considered too passionate to pursue sensuality within reason. She was seen as Eve, the temptress, the gullible one, who easily falls into sensual temptation, the origin of original sin, and the curse of explosive sexual desire. The husband was viewed as Adam, the rational one, who could responsibly initiate sexual intercourse. Sex was not something that the woman should enjoy for her own pleasure, but rather as a duty owed to her husband and his prosperity, to bear fruit for him and multiply his seed. rendering of the Genesis myth restricts all that is possible in healthy human sensual expression? As this constricted view of sexuality crystallized into an enforced convention, it diverged significantly from naturally emergent norms of sexuality. Of course, like a waterfall, nature seeks to fill a void, so deviance from such a narrow and divergent conventionality was inevitable. The narrower the limitation upon healthy sexual expression, the more robust would be the explosion of freed sexual energy. Any damage, real or imagined, would readily justify stricter enforcement of this narrow conventionality. The convention of sexuality was beaten back, and sexual expression has more recently been afforded much more natural variation. Could this be the result of a popular transnormativity overcoming a narrower unormativity? What about other expressions of transnormativity? Let us return to gender. Gender norms have some basis in naturally emergent norms. There is a definite biological distinction between the typical man and the typical woman. The male role in reproduction tends not to be as emotionally invested as the female's reproductive role. This results in stereotypical behaviors for men and for women, not only in humans, but in non-humans as well. Even in biology, there are exceptions. Many are born with ambiguous reproductive organs, whether a female with an enlarged clitoris that appears as a micropenis, or a male born with a vaginal opening in addition to his penis, or all points in between and beyond. These are intersexual persons who actually number in the thousands. Largely from socially constructed gender norms, they are pressed into invisibility. Naturally occurring physiological sex differentiation clusters around a mean and then spread outward toward the outlier of possibilities. These emergent gender norms provide a widely familiar foundation for the convergent norms of human construction. Since males were recognized as demonstrably more aggressive than the typical female, men were culturally assigned as hunters and protectors. Since the female is recognized as being more consistently nurturing for the young, women were culturally assigned as food preparers and primary caregivers. As hunter-gatherer tribes evolved into village communities and onto larger societies, these primordial roles segued into the gendered roles we would recognize today. By the 20th century, men were expected to serve as breadwinners outside of the home while women served as domestics. These roles tended to satisfy social needs while undercutting individual ego needs. As mentioned earlier, nature seeks to balance, toward an ideal midpoint, our ego and social needs. Social norms often compel us to fixate on an outward direction. We sometimes get stuck on routines where we spend more time and energy on what we believe is important for others than what we need for ourselves, at least in spaces shared with others. So little boys make sure they never cry openly in front of others, then learn how to consistently turn their fears into anger. Little girls learn their social value can be based on how pretty they appear, then routinely struggle to live up to popular ideals of objectified femininity. Rigid submission to these norms easily leads to anormativity, which often results in dysfunctional shame. To counteract this ingrained attention to the expectations of others, nature compels a refocusing upon one's neglected ego needs with an inward direction. Nature is no respecter of culture. If you spend too much attention on others at the expense of your own need for survival or growth potential, nature will compel you to behave in ways to try to correct this imbalance. This includes a compulsion to go against humanly constructed norms for gender expression, at least the more stifling norms. This expresses a natural gender transnormativity. Guys defy expectations and show their softer side. Gals dismiss expectations to be maternal and focus on career development. On the surface, it may appear they are self-absorbed, but they are attending to their neglected ego needs. Only by more adequately resolving this inward need to stand independently on their own will they have sufficient capacity to respect their social needs with others. As these gender traits converge to form a new sense of wholeness, they emerge as new gender norms. Such gender transnormativity can be seen impacting feminism, the men's movement, as well as the transgender experience. Sexuality is undergoing a similar transformation. Norms governing sensuality have their root in naturally emergent norms. Survival of the species depends upon the biologically rooted norms for reproduction. A routine naturally evolves to ensure males and females produce and support offspring to perpetuate their own kind. Until the group establishes numbers to increase its survival capacity, there is an understandable shared emphasis on the reproductive role of sexuality. No seed is to be wasted, no sexual energy spent except that will increase their numbers. These natural concerns shape the group's expected sexual behaviors, converging into humanly constructed sexuality norms. When group survival is no longer in doubt, the other functions of sexuality are free to come to the fore. As basic needs are adequately met, our growth needs are naturally triggered, like the need for deeper intimacy to reach more of life's potential. Sometimes the only way for older sexuality norms to be pushed aside is through sexual transnormativity. This discussion will resume in part 4.